within the Bloodline storyline, obviously Paul Heyman is a big part of that. And I wanted to talk about your relationship with Paul Heyman over the years, because you were at odds, when you were running WCW, he was running ECW. You worked together in WWE in 2019. How did your relationship with him evolve over the years?
It's funny. When I first broke into the wrestling business back in 1987, seems like 1,000 years ago, another lifetime. That's when I first met Paul Heyman, because Paul Heyman was working for Vern Gagne in Minneapolis at the same time I got hired. And Paul was working with a guy by the name of Rob Russin. So Rob Russin and Paul, their only involvement in the AWA was live events, promoting live events around the country. So I didn't work directly with Paul because I was in sales and syndication. So there was just no overlap between us. But that's when I first met Paul. And then I ran into Paul again in the early 90s in WCW. Paul was there as a talent. Paul E. Dangerously had that ridiculous brick mobile phone. He was always hitting people in the head with it, But Paul was a very big part of WCW when I arrived in WCW. And at that point, he was a talent, I was a talent. So we had more, interaction and opportunity to work together. And I got to know Paul fairly well there. Paul was just a different person than I was. There were certain things about Paul that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. And it's probably because, Paul was from the East Coast, from New York. I'm kind of a Midwest guy. Different cultures, we didn't really hit it off. I didn't dislike him. It's just that we never really became friends. And then fast forward, Paul leaves WCW. I progress in my role in WCW. Paul starts ECW. And one of the things that Paul did so brilliantly, I may not have liked it at the time, but I did admit it was brilliant. I admitted it to myself. I would never give him the credit publicly. But one of the things that Paul did so well is he became the underdog. He was the small renegade rebel promotion that did things that, the traditional wrestling companies couldn't or wouldn't do. Here's an example. Paul was so small and he was such a renegade promotion that Paul would use very popular music that was a hit at the time. But because Paul was this little company that had the little bit of television distribution, he was kind of off everybody's radar. He was using current hot music in his open of his show that he didn't even license. A big company like WWE or WCW at the time, man, we would have been hit with cease and desist and fines and lawsuits and all kinds of stuff. But Paul was off the radar. So he was doing all that stuff and the fans really loved it. He did a lot of really progressive things that have never been done before. And some of it because he could get away with it where other companies couldn't, bigger companies couldn't. But the thing that made Paul really brilliant is he made WWE, which is ironic because WWE was funding him. People didn't know it at the time, but he made WWE the bad guy, that big giant company that just hates little companies like ECW and, trying to put us out of business or trying to keep us down. And it galvanized the audience, right? They felt like, okay, we're on Paul's team. We hate WWE. They're the big corporate conglomerate. There's a little group of rebels over here doing stuff we like. So we're going to be on Paul's team. And he did the same thing with me in WCW. And 75% of it wasn't true, but he'd talk about Bischoff is trying to put us out of business. He's trying to steal our talent. He made me the enemy. I was the antagonist. And the truth is, I couldn't even watch the show. I couldn't get it. It was so obscure as a television product that you had to be really, really determined to find it. I jokingly say, back in that time, because he was on these little tiny stations at 2:00 in the morning, and I used to joke, and it's not really a joke, it's kind of true, but you had to wrap yourself in aluminum foil, stand up on the roof of your house with a coat hanger and a television, a small TV, and maybe then you could get the signal, right? But Paul constantly made me in particular, and in many respects the same way with WWE, made us the enemy. Well, when you do that, you galvanize your audience. You're giving them a cause. You're giving them something to root for beyond just watching the show. And that's how he became, I'm going to use the word cult, but not in a derisive sense, but he kind of created this cult-like phenomenon amongst his talent and amongst the audience. Now, fast forward again, it's 2001 or whatever it was, where I get hired by WWE to come in as the general manager. Now, here's Paul again. Like, we've been following each other around for 25 years at that point. It started in 1987 and carried over into the early 90s in WCW. And bam, here we are again in the early 2000s. He's a talent in WWE and I'm a talent in WWE. Now, the audience, and this was so cool, Kenny, this is so cool. The audience still believed we hated each other because of all the things Paul said, some of the things I said, because I was not quite as outspoken as Paul, but pretty much. So the audience was convinced that we hated each other. So Paul and I would see each other at TV and we go sit somewhere in a corner where people couldn't see us, where nobody's going to take a picture of us sitting together. And we had the best conversations because Paul's a brilliant cat. He's so interesting and he's fascinating. He's not just interesting. He leveled up to fascinating a long time ago. And I really respected Paul's creative point of view. And I think Paul, to a certain degree, respected mine as well, because of, what I accomplished and what happened and all that. I earned, at least to some degree, his respect, but we got along great. And we'd go out to dinner. Like I had an office in LA at that point, I was producing shows outside of wrestling, and Paul would sometimes come out to LA and we go out to dinner. And in fact, at one point, we started working on a movie script together and it was fun. It was great, but we kept up that perception that we hated each other and we joked about it. Well, no, it wasn't even a joke. We were serious about it. We said, someday there may be some money here. There may be a storyline, kind of like I did with Steve Austin. Steve Austin, same thing. He was constant, I fired him by FedEx and all that stuff. He used to make fun of me on ECW when he was there. And it was all good stuff. It was great. But there was, when I finally had a program, a storyline with Steve Austin in WWE in 2003 or whatever it was, there was like 15 years of backstory built in because the audience already perceived us as having this adversarial relationship. That it wasn't true, but it looked that way. And the same was true with Paul. So we would never publicly put each other over. We would never be seen outside the arena together because we wanted to maintain that feeling that we really did dislike each other, in the hopes at some point there would be an opportunity to make some money with it. But there's nobody that I probably respect more. There's some people I respect as much, but I don't think there's anybody that I respect more than Paul Heyman. But I got to tell you, making out with Stephanie in front of her dad, because he was producing it. He was standing like 10 feet away and I'm bending her over a desk, swapping spit. And that was different.